So now everybody's silent.
Hi, I'm Carol. I
Yeah,
got a haircut. I don't know if you recognize me. Yeah,
I
and and I just came back from the physical therapist. I had therapy on my face this morning. So behind the bandage and under the new hairstyle, Carol.
I recognized you, Carol.
Oh, good, good.
I was wondering what the bandage was.
Yeah, yeah. I get needled.
Okay.
So
Maggie is home with a cold, so she's with me for the afternoon.
hi,
Hi.
Hello.
Maggie.
Hope you feel better.
We just got back a negative COVID test, so that's really good.
Great.
Very good. Always good.
Always good. Okay, I think I'm going to begin because we have a lot to do today. So, I wanted to give you an introduction to, since we're starting the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, and I wanted to acknowledge the teaching of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha. It's always good to recognize our a wise teacher, and he was one of the wisest. And so these reflections that I am about to give you are, to a great extent, from his essay Vayikra, Between Destiny and Chance. That's the name of his essay. So, first of all, the book of Leviticus, the name of the book itself is interesting, that it's derived from Greek and Latin pertaining to the Levites. It's a priestly book. Its ancient name was actually Torat Kohanim, the law of the priests. So, whereas Shmot and Bamidbar, Exodus and Numbers, are narrative books, Leviticus is about sacrifices and rituals associated first with the Mishkan and later with the temple. It's about the priests, it's about their functions as the guardians of the sacred. And by contrast, the traditional name Vayikra, and notice that I'm trying very hard to say it in a way that the last letter is almost inaudible, and we'll get to that. Um, Rabbi Sachs says that it seems merely accidental. The name of the book seems merely accidental. Vayikra happens to be the first word of the book, and there is no connection with that word with the rest of with what it deals with. But Rabbi Sachs argues that there is a deep connection between the word Vayikra and the underlying message of the book as a whole. To understand this, we have to pay attention to the unusual way it appears in the Torah. The Sofrim, the scribes, would write it in a very small way. So the first Vav, Yud, Kuf, Resh were all large, and the final Aleph was always very small, almost as if it barely existed in the word. Um, Unlike Vayikra, the first letters of the word spell out Vayikar, which means he encountered or he chanced upon. Now, unlike Vayikra, which refers to a call, a summons, a meeting by request, Vayikar suggests an accidental meeting, mere happening. We could say in modern Hebrew that it happened bimikre, it happened by chance. So with their sensitivity to nuance, the ancient rabbis, noted the difference between the call to Moshe, with which the book begins, and God's appearance to the pagan prophet Balaam in the book of Numbers, chapter 22. And here's a midrash on that, which says, what is the difference between the prophets of Israel and the prophets of the pagan nations of the world? Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina says, the Holy One, blessed be he, reveals himself to the pagan nations by an incomplete form of address. As it is said, and the Lord appeared to Bilam, Vayavo Adonai el Bilam. He came to him. He just arrived, Bimikre, happened upon him. Whereas to the prophets of Israel he appeared in a complete form of address, as it is said, Vayikra el Moshe. He came, he called to him, he summoned him by request. Rashi in the 11th century in northern France was even more explicit. He writes, all God's communications to Moshe, whether they use the words speak or say or command, were preceded by a call, a kriya, which is a term of endearment used by the angels. It's just like when the angels called to each other, V'kara ze el ze ve'omar. We say it each time when we say the Kedusha. V'kara, karu ze el ze. They call to one another in a form of endearment. However, to the pagan prophets, Rashi continues, God's appearance is described by an expression signifying a casual encounter and uncleanness. And it says, and the Lord appeared to Bilam, Vayavo Adonai el Bilam, and Yud-He Vav-He came to Bilam. Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher in the 13th century, who is known as the Baal HaTurim, goes one stage further and he comments on the small aleph. And he says, Moshe was both great and humble and wanted only to write Vayikra, signifying a chance meeting as if the Holy One appeared to him only in a dream. As it says of Bilam, Vayikra, without an aleph, suggesting that God appeared to Moshe by chance. However, God told Moshe to write the word with an aleph. Moshe then said to him, because of his extreme humility, that he would only write an aleph that was smaller than the other alephs in the Torah, and Moshe indeed wrote it small. So Rabbi Sachs comments on that and says something is of great significance is being hinted of here. But before we take it further, let's turn to the end of the book, to Parashat Bechukotai. There occurs one of the two most terrifying passages in the Torah. It is known as Tohaha, or chastisement. And it details the terrible fate that will befall the Jewish people if it fails to keep its covenant with God. In Leviticus 26, verses 36 to 38, God says, I will bring such insecurity upon those of you who survive in your enemy's land that the sound of a driven leaf will make them flee from the sword. They will fall with no one chasing them. The land of your enemies will consume you. Yet despite the terrifying nature of this forewarning, the passage ends with a note of consolation, as often happens in the text. I will remember my covenant with Yaakov, as well as my covenant with Yitzchak and my covenant with Abraham. I will remember the land. Even when they are in their enemy's land, I will not reject them or abhor them so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am Adonai, their God. But for their sake I will remember the covenant with their ancestors whom I brought out of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. I am Adonai. The key word of the passage is kari. It appears exactly 7 times in the Tohaha. I called them out, a sure sign of significance. The calling out is an endearment. It's a sign of affection. It's a sign of the covenant. The sages understand kari to be related on the one hand to mikre, meaning chance. The curses in his interpretation are not divine retribution as such. It will not be God who makes Israel suffer. It will be other human beings. That's why it's Tohaha. That's why it's chastisement. What will happen is simply that God will withdraw his protection. Israel will have to face the world alone, without the sheltering presence of God. This is, for the sages, simple and inescapable midah keneged midah, a measure for measure. If the people of Israel believe in divine providence, they will be blessed by divine providence. And Rabbi Sachs says, if they see history as mere chance, what, as Joseph Heller, author of Catch-22, called a trash bag of random coincidences blown open by the wind, then they themselves indeed will be left to chance. Being a small, vulnerable nation, chance will not be kind to them. Now we can go back to the remarkable proposition linking the beginning of Vayikra to the end, says Rabbi Sachs, and one of the most profound of all spiritual truths. The difference between mikra, calling, endearment, and mikre, between history as God's call, God's endearing, caring, loving call, and history as simply one event after another with no purpose or meaning, is in the Hebrew language almost imperceptible. The words sound the same: mikra, mikre, kriya, and so on. The only difference is that the former has an aleph, while the latter does not. The significance of the aleph is obvious. The first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the first letter of the Ten Commandments, Anochi, I am, Adonai Elohechem, the I of God, the capital I am Adonai your God, Anochi with an aleph. But in Vayikra, the letter aleph is almost inaudible. Its appearance in a Sefer Torah at the beginning of Vayikra, the small aleph, is almost invisible. Do not expect, the Torah is intimating, that the presence of God in history will always be as clear and unambiguous as it was during the exodus from Egypt and the division of the Red Sea. For much of the time it will depend on your own sensitivity. For those who look, it will be visible. For those who listen, it can be heard. But first, you have to look and listen. If you choose not to see or hear, then the Vayikra becomes Vayikar. This is the distinction that Rabbi Sachs makes. The call will be inaudible. History will seem like mere chance. There is nothing incoherent about such an idea. Those who believe it will have much to justify it. Indeed, God says in the Tohaha, in the Chastisement, if you believe that history is chance, then history will become chance. It will become so. But in truth, it is not so. The history of the Jewish people, as even non-Jews such as Rousseau and Tolstoy eloquently stated, testifies to the presence of God in their midst. Only thus could such a small, vulnerable, relatively powerless people survive and still say today, after the Holocaust, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people lives. And just as Jewish history is not mere chance, so it is no mere coincidence that the first word of the central book of the Torah is Vayikra, and he called. To be a Jew is to believe that what happens to us as a people is God's loving call to us to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. I was very intrigued by Rabbi Sacks's teaching and his conclusion that there is a profound difference between mikre, happenstance, and mikra, history as God's call. Years ago, I was taught that this is also the difference between keva, the rote, habitual utterance of prayer that loses its meaning and is then merely a happenstance of prayer and also a happenstance of life. And the difference between that and kavanah, the spiritual intentionality and direction of the heart that comes with authentic and heartfelt prayer and the living of an authentic life. The word kavanah is from the shoresh, the Hebrew root kivun, direction. Thus I was taught that just as mikra, God's loving call in history, has its direction, so when we have kavanah, our lives have direction and purpose. Now, some of the classical reconstructionists that I encountered felt uncomfortable with Rabbi Sacks's notion of God's call in history. They interpreted it as a supernatural God directing history. But I think that Rabbi Sacks is suggesting something different. He is, I think, suggesting that the forward motion of Jewish history and the survival of our people, Am Yisrael Chai, is actually dependent not on a supernatural God, but on our own ability to listen and to hear the silent, inaudible Aleph of Vayikra and respond to its call. If we, the Jewish people, are able to respond, then we will not only survive, but also thrive. For Reconstructionists, history and human action become inextricably bound together. And we are the respondents to that history. We are not passive observers or recipients. We are respondents to it and actors in it. And that's why when God calls to us, God's calling to us in a loving relationship, even when things don't go so well for us. And sometimes God engages in Tohaha to us because we are not responding. So that's the observation that I have concerning the letter Aleph, with the help of my teacher and all of our teachers, Rabbi Sacks. And now I'd like to go to the source sheet. If you can put it up, Audrey. And we're going to read a little bit more about some midrashim on the first word, Vayikra. And then we're going to look a little bit at sacrifices. I believe next week we're going to be looking a lot at sacrifices. So today is just an opening to that. So if you can pull it up a little bit more, Audrey. Let's look at Vayikra chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Can somebody read there, please?
This is Nancy. I'd be happy to read.
Thank you.
Note that the aleph in the first word, Vayikra, is smaller than the other letters. Note also that it doesn't say Vayikra Yud He Vav He El Moshe, even though the English translation says the Lord called to Moses. Literally, the text says blank called to Moses. This is the way it appears in the Torah scroll and in printed editions. Why is the aleph smaller? Who called to Moses? Rabbi Elise Frischman teaches the word Vayikra gives a verb, but no clear subject. Blank called to Moses. We assume that it was God who called. If so, then this seems unnecessarily repetitive, because the verse continues, God called to Moses, and then God spoke to him. Calling is a form of speech. So if God called, why does it add God spoke?
Okay, let's stop right there for a moment. If you look at the Hebrew, it doesn't start out with Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. It simply starts Vayikra el Moshe. So there is no subject, but just the verb Vayikra el Moshe, and then it says Vayidaber Adonai elav me'ohel moed lemor. Daber el bnei Yisrael va'amarta alehem. So it's a little anomalous, this kind of opening, and so it gives much more emphasis to the Vayikra, and we pay attention to the word, and we pay attention to the small aleph in it, and that gives the midrashists lots of room for interpretation. Okay, go on, Nancy, please.
Sure. The Hebrew unveils the mystery. The first word, Vayikra, is written with a small aleph, so that it's sort of like this, Vayikar aleph, with that small aleph hovering next to the rest of the word. This separates the aleph from the rest of the word, creating two words, Vayikar aleph. Vayikar aleph can be translated as Aleph was precious to Moses.
Okay, let's stop there for a moment. What do we know about the letter Aleph? Can anybody sort of say something just about the letter?
First letter of the alphabet.
First letter. So
It's silent. It's just a placeholder.
right, it's a placeholder. How do we pronounce it?
Whatever the vowel is given to it.
With the vowel that's given to it and with the consonants that are surrounding it. In and of itself, it's silent. So that's significant. It's silent. So if we read it as Vayakar, if we read it as Aleph was precious to Moses.
So silence was precious to Moses.
Silence was precious. The ineffable, the mysterious was precious to Moses. Okay, let's go on.
It's also, sorry, Zachary, doesn't it also signify one, the numeral one as well?
One, the one.
So maybe it could be looked at as one or the one, right, as well?
Right, absolutely. Okay, so Aleph was precious to Moses. Okay, Nancy, can you continue there, please?
Who is Aleph? The 13th century mystical Kabbalistic work, the Zohar, reveals.
It's at the Zohar. That's
the Zohar, okay. Reveals that small Hebrew letters in the Torah signify the lower world that God inhabits. This lower world is ours. The small letter Aleph in particular represents the Shekhinah, the so-called feminine presence of God. It's the way we experience God in the details of daily life and the physical world. The Shekhinah represents our joy and our pain, our triumphs and our losses, the totality of our experiences. The Shekhinah is our life.
So the Shekhinah is the immanence of God, is the God in the here and now in this world. Okay, go on, please.
But the Shekhinah isn't just my life or yours alone. It is all of our lives, all Jews, all people, all the world. To hear the call of the Shekhinah is not just to hear one's own heart, it's to hear the heart of the stranger, to look into her eyes, to touch his soul.
Okay, let's continue.
Now let's try our new translation of the verse, because the Shekhinah, the life of all people, was precious to Moses. So God spoke to him.
So what we see here is a turning around of the whole phrase here, and it's establishing a relationship which is going to be the relationship into which all these mitzvot surrounding sacrifice, surrounding the priests is going to be placed. It's not going to be just arbitrarily a set of laws. It's a set of relational laws. God Aleph loves the people. Because Shekhinah, the life of all the people, because God was precious to Moses, so this God spoke to Moses. And now God is going to bring to Moses a set of mitzvot that are filled with love. And that's a very interesting way to think about the commandments surrounding the priest's garments, to think about the commandments surrounding the various kinds of sacrifices and so on. If we're just reading them without this framework, it doesn't feel very relational. It just feels very commanding without much else. But it's set from the very first sentence of the book into a framework of deep relationship. Okay, please go on.
Another insight. Perhaps Vayikra begins with a small aleph to whisper, get over yourself. Moses made himself smaller, as it says in Numbers 12:3. Moses was humbler than any other person. With humility, he overcame his fear of failure. Because he was so humble, he was able to make room for God in his life and evolved from being a prince of Egypt to being a servant of God's people.
Okay, this goes back to the midrash that Rabbi Sachs brings us about Moshe being so humble that he didn't want the aleph to be the same size as the rest of the letters. Okay, let's stop here with this other interpretation. What do you think about the humility piece and Moshe being from Prince of Egypt to servant of the people? How does that sit with you? Steve?
So as I wrote in the chat just now, what struck me before reading or hearing the reading saying humility was the word empathy, that life, the Shekinah being precious to Moses, to me, conveys the sense of empathy for all of God's people or all of God's creation, whatever, that he cares about what's going on in the world around him and is not just totally self-centered, which to me is a significant and important characteristic along with humility.
Right, so that the same empathy, the same love, in a sense, that God has is now transferred in some way to Moshe. And Moshe is feeling this sense of connection to the people, that he is not going to become a prince over Israel. He's going to become a servant of the people, and he understands their trials and tribulations, even though he gets very angry with them at times, but he understands them in that way. Malcolm.
Yes, I want to, in terms of humility, I remember when Moses was at the burning bush, that he said, I can't do this, I can't even speak well. I mean, how am I gonna do this job? I can't do this.
Right, which, by the way, is not only was it attributed to Moses, but it's a common motif for all the prophets of Israel, that every single one of them, when they are called to their task, they say, no, I can't do this. I am unable to take on this responsibility, perhaps because they understand how difficult a job it is, but also because they understand the magnitude of the job to be a prophet amongst the people. Could be that as well. Nancy.
I'm trying to think about this idea of prince versus servant, and the idea that when he was a prince, he had superficially all kinds of power, but he was also afraid. There was lots of times he was afraid. And by, this act of becoming a servant, and that idea of being humble and being open to greater forces, forces of God, forces of truth, righteousness, that he actually feels more strength and courage. And this is really thinking about like how, what is really power? Is power the superficial trappings of a prince and a crown and that, or is power really this deeper understanding?
Right. And I think that maybe I'm projecting, but it seems to me that the opening of the book is a way of looking at a loving God speaking to Moshe, and Moshe actually feeling that he feels that this is not the um, transcendent God who is so above and beyond the world that 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 this God cannot convey love. But there's a conveying of love in this beginning that Moshe feels, and Moshe can relate to that and relate with humility to it, and then act accordingly with the people. Bob?
Uh, what I've been thinking about with this is, sorry, Annie will pick that up. Okay. I'm sorry. I always admired Martin Buber's, philosophy, I and thou, people approaching each other as equals. I recently read about Emmanuel Levinas, who had a philosophy that others were actually more important than yourself. It's a philosophy of humility. I thought about this being a position, that I have a value of trying to take care of myself, but also a value of taking care of my patients. And that I would, walk into the room of a sick person, even if it put myself at risk. And they're both values, but I would choose to put taking care of my patient a little bit higher than the value of taking care of myself. And it's a measure of that humility that Moses put himself in a place where taking care of the people was more important than his own embarrassment at his limitations.
I think that that's true. And when we look at it in the larger picture, we realize that it's both very, very beneficial to the people, but not always so beneficial to Moshe. As we saw last week, that in the end, it wasn't his own family, it wasn't his own sons who were coming into the priesthood as he might have liked, but our own sons. And he didn't do so well by his own family, but sometimes that's the price that public figures pay for their being public figures. I see two people, and then we're going to go on to our next midrash. Steve, and then Bob.
So if I may say another word that's just come to me in sort of in light of yesterday being International Women's Day, the thought occurs to me that, setting aside for the moment the problematic aspect of whether Moshe was a historic figure or simply a figure in our cultural consciousness, if he truly did exist and have these characteristics of humility and empathy, I suspect much of that was seeded, in his youth by his both his adopted mother, the princess or whatever her name was, and perhaps his biological mother who nursed him, or if that story has any real reality. But I wanted to give a nod to those two women who may have set him on the path that he later took on.
Thank you for that. And I would also add Miriam, his sister, his older sister, who was very influential in his life. Yes, Bob Barkin.
Just to be a little contrarian, I think there's a whole line of midrash that Moses wasn't all that humble, that his humbleness with God was a little bit of disingenuousness in order to get some help, that he had Aaron, that he showed signs of temper, and he actually killed a man. And I think not to say that he didn't have some humility, I'm not saying that, but that he was a very complete man as described, and that there's more than just the one thread of humility, that there was a lot of aspects of Moses.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. And there has been quite a bit written, not so much about a lack of humility, but a weakness of anger in Moses. Definitely. Okay, let's go on to the next. Audrey, if you could put up the source sheet again. I see that Audrey's not on the line. Maybe she went away, but no, Audrey's back. Let's go up to another interpretation. If you could bring that up to the top. Okay. If someone could read that, I'd appreciate it. Someone, please.
I can do it. Okay. A midrash. The Zohar relates that before creation, each letter of the alphabet came before God, asking him to use it to begin the process of creation. The letters presented themselves in reverse order. First was Tav, the last letter of the alphabet. Next was Shin, the second to last letter of the alphabet, then Resh, and so on, up to Beit, the second letter of the alphabet, who said, "Let the world be created with me, so that all the beings shall use me to bless God." Beit being the first letter of Baruch, blessing, and God assented. Then he asked the Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, who has not uttered a word, why it was silent. The Aleph replied that in a world of plurality, there was no place for it, since its numerical value is 1. In Hebrew numerology, every letter corresponds to a number, Aleph to 1, Beit to 2, Gimel to 3, and so on. God assured the Aleph, saying that even if the world would be created with the Beit, Aleph would still be the queen of the alphabet. He said, "Have no fear, Aleph, you are the one, and I am the one, and I am one. I want to create the world to have my spirit of oneness dwell there through the study of Torah and the performance of mitzvot, the commandments. The first of the 10 commandments will begin with the Aleph of the word Anochi, I am the Lord your God." I keep going?
Yes, please.
The Aleph is silent. It can bring great insight if we allow ourselves to sit in silence and listen for the still, small voice of God. When the prophet Elijah sought a message from God, in the end, he heard God's voice to him, not in the fire, but in the still, small voice of God. The Aleph is the silent letter that symbolizes the silence of spirit, from which all sound flows. Sometimes the best form of praise to God is to remain silence. As the psalmist has told us, to you, silence is praise.
Lecha dumiyah tehillah is the Hebrew for that. And so there are many, many meditations on the Aleph, most of them coming from this first line, these first words of Sefer Vayikra. And this is the one that I like the most, about the silence of the letter Aleph, because we are a people of many, many words. We are a people we are a verbose people, and sometimes we need silence to contemplate what we have read or what we have experienced, and the Aleph helps us do that. Let's continue down. And now we're going to sacrifice. Let's go to Sefer Vayikra, chapter 1, verse 3 and forward. And what we're going to read here is about at least a few of the korbanot. First, we need to be clear what the word korban means. It comes from the root karov, kuf resh bet, which means close or near. So when the Israelites performed korbanot, they were trying to come close to Yud He Vav He, to come close to God. And it is in some ways equivalent to the Latin sacri facere, to make sacred. And so that the mundane becomes sacred in some way. And in our tradition, it means that by doing an act that would seem prosaic or mundane, like slaughtering an animal for food, we take it out of that realm and we make it something holy with a kavanah that is a way of drawing closer to God, and a kavanah, a direction, an intentionality that gives it holy intent. So if we can read from A here in Hebrew, can someone please read that for us? Whoever.
In Hebrew, those three letters are a root that means to draw near. In Arabic, the same is true. The adjective karov means near. The noun kiruv means a form of outreach, usually made by religious Jews to those who they perceive to be non-religious, aimed at enabling someone to draw closer to God. That's what a korban was, a way of drawing closer. Our ancestors took it as a given that everything in creation belongs to God. Given that everything we own and everything we don't own already belongs to the Holy Blessed One, what can we offer to God such that the act of offering it will draw us closer together? There's a traditional understanding that after the fall of the temple, the home table of every Jew becomes a mikdash me'at, a small sanctuary. This may be especially true on Shabbat and festivals, times when we take pains to make our tables holy spaces, with white tablecloths, with the sanctification of wine, with challah or matzah sprinkled with salt. But I think even our kitchen tables piled with bills, our coffee tables scattered with old newspapers or children's toys can be holy altars if we eat on them with mindfulness and intent. When we pause to bless the food we're about to eat, we have the opportunity to make ourselves mindful of the earth in which it was grown or on which it was raised, the hands which tended it and brought it to our table, the hands which prepared it, and of course, of the infinite source of blessing from whom all of these blessings flow. When we pause to be thankful after we've eaten, then the food becomes a stimulus for recognizing our gratitude. Does God need our blessings? Reb Marsha Prager teaches that prayer is something like a cry of the infant, which stimulates the flow of its mother's milk. More than the calf wants to suckle, said the rabbis of the Talmud, the cow wants to give milk. God wants to stream blessing into the world. Our prayers, our cries, prime that cosmic pump. When we say please, and when we say thank you, you're sending our energy toward the Holy One, which in turn stimulates the flow of blessing back to us. This is a korban.
Okay, let's read what the korbanot is about. I'll read it since I've got it right here. Um, if when any of you presents an offering of cattle to the Lord, he shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall make his offering a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance on his behalf before the Lord. He shall lay his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, that it may be acceptable on his behalf in expiation for him. So that is called the olah. The bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall offer the blood, dashing the blood against all the sides of the altar, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The burnt offering, the olah, shall be flayed and cut up into sections. The sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire on the altar and lay out wood upon the fire, and Aaron's sons the priest shall lay out the sections with the head and the suet on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. Its entrails and legs shall be washed with water, and the priest shall turn the whole into smoke on the altar as a burnt offering and an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. If his offering for a burnt offering is for the flock of sheep or of goats, he shall make his offering a male without blemish. It shall be slaughtered before the Lord on the north side of the altar, and Aharon's sons, the priest, shall dash its blood against all sides of the altar. When it has been cut up into sections, the priest shall lay it out with the head and the suet on the wood that is on the fire of the altar. The entrails and the legs shall be washed with water. The priest shall offer it up and turn the whole thing into smoke on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. If his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, he shall choose his offering from turtle doves or pigeons. The priest shall bring it to the altar, pinch off its head, and turn it into smoke on the altar, and its blood shall be drained out against the side of the altar. He shall remove its crop with its content and cast it into the place of the ashes at the east side of the altar. The priest shall tear it open by its wings without severing it, and turn it into the smoke on the altar upon the wood that is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. So why all the different kinds here? You have a goat, you have a bull or a cattle, and then you have a bird. Why all the different kinds here? Ralph?
Well, I always had a problem with I never understood, if God is the source of creation, you're taking things that God created and you're mutilating them, and then you're giving it back to God. So it's kind of a strange, it's like having a farmer and bringing them fresh produce.
Which we do.
Well, okay, yeah. So I never quite understood, what the message is here about sacrifices and what we're trying to do. It's things that we need and we're trying to do without. So I just wanted to put that out there as a start.
Okay. Shlomo, do you have a response to that, perhaps?
Yes, I do. Don't forget that I'm a Kohen, and the Kohanim had to have a living. This is the food for the Kohanim.
Right.
And this is essentially, I think, well, no question about it, Vayikra is a P document. And it's the Sefer of the Kohanim, Torah Kohanim. So that's one thing. With regard to the question that you asked, why so many different kinds of animals, it would seem to me that the different kinds of animals could represent different levels of wealth of the people. Not everybody would have a cow or a cattle or whatever, but he could have a dove or this or that. And so it makes it possible for, regardless of socioeconomic status, if such a thing existed then in the desert, for everybody to make sacrifice.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. There were many, many families who couldn't bring a whole animal, who couldn't bring a goat, or who couldn't bring a larger cattle, but they could bring a bird. And later on, right after this in chapter 2, you're going to have an offering of meal, a grain offering. There is an economic principle here at work that everyone, even the person of most modest means, can contribute. And in terms of why do it, they didn't have the concepts that we do of an internal spiritual life. For them, this was the way of coming to God and getting closer. And actually, sometime you might want to invite Shlomo to talk about a pleasing odor to God, because he has a different perspective on it than I do. But the pleasing odor to God, notice that it's repeated 3 times here, and it's repeated further on as well. They really believed in this notion of the sacred barbecue, and I'm not saying that in a disrespectful way, but they really believed that as this odor wafted up into the heavens, there was that God was smelling it, that God was feeling it, that God was experiencing their dedication and devotion. And this was the sensory part of this was as important as everything else. So that was part of the whole thing. Yes, Nancy.
I have a question. Okay, maybe it's a mechanical question, but we learned about all of the vestments and what the priests wear, and it seemed like it was very specific and ornate and all. And then you read this and you think, God, this was just a totally messy, process. And I'm just sort of trying to imagine the priests with all their beautiful vestments, with all this blood spattering around, and like has anybody written about, I mean, did they like cover everything just to do this and then take off their coverings to
I'm sure they've written about it. I don't know. I plead ignorance on that, but remember that there were many Levites who were not priests who helped them out. So I would suspect that there were deputies who helped in all of this, but I can't tell you that for sure, that how they kept themselves clean. But the spattering of the blood in and of itself has great power to them, because blood, of course, is the life force. So we only have a few minutes, so I'd like us to look at these, what Rabbi Shefa Gold teaches us, because what she does is she spiritualizes for our time what for them perhaps was not so pertinent, but perhaps for us is. So I'm going to ask Joan, would you mind reading?
No, I can read it. Rabbi Shefa Gold teaches, so often the complications of life seem to draw us away from the perspectives of holiness. We become alienated, distracted, complacent, blind to what is essential, deaf to the music at the core of silence, numb to the mystery that dwells at the heart of this life. Our daily struggles sometimes close us off from the flow of the great love. The blessings of Vayikra is the call us to come into harmony, balance, connection, and intimacy with God, who has freed us for this love, and not only to return, but to establish for ourselves a system of continual returning. The medicine that Vayikra gives us for the disease of our alienation from God is described in the language of korbanot, the sacrifices. Literally, korbanot means bringing ourselves near again to God. The korbanot were a powerful and effective means of engaging all of the senses, witnessing the power of life and death, and then sharing a sacred meal in the presence of God. The result was as experienced as a total purification, removal of obstructions, and a reconnection to the flow of God's love and presence. And for a time, this was a spiritual technology that worked well. The spiritual challenge, our tradition tells us that prayer now takes the place of sacrifices. The spiritual challenge of Vayikra is to make our prayer life as powerful, as intense, and as effective as the sacrificial system was for our ancestors. Can the words of a prayer engage the senses fully? Can we taste it, smell it, touch it, feel its blood, hear its music and the silence within it, witness its passage into the void, see it in the shadow of death and the spark of life? Do we leave our prayer feeling purified, our burdens lifted? Our ancestors celebrated their new state of connection by sharing a sacred meal with the priests and with God. After praying in community, can we also make our celebrations holy? Can we eat these sacred meals, our Kiddush and Oneg Shabbat gatherings, knowing that each bite of our feast is also tasted and enjoyed by God? Vayikra describes a number of different kinds of sacrifices, each one directed towards correcting a specific imbalance or disease of the soul, which removes us from God's presence. Our practice of prayer is meant to bring us close again. The Ola, go ahead.
Let's stop there. I'm aware of time, and we are going to be going over these sacrifices next week. So we're going to stop here, and I will ask Audrey to bring up this part, if you can save it and bring it up at the beginning of our next time together. We can do that because it will take us longer than we have, which is about another minute or so. And I respect your time and mine, so I don't want to go over. What I want to end with is to say that the entire experience of the book of Vayikra is an experience of understanding, one, the relationship between Moshe and God, two, the relationship between God and the people and their understanding, hopefully their understanding of the mitzvot of the sacrifices as having great power for them to come closer. The korbanot are a very, very important part of their way of maintaining their religious and spiritual life. Without them, they would be bereft of a unifying factor in the growth of their religion. And it's very important to understand, and many rabbis say that of all the books, the 5 books of the Torah, Leviticus is the central book. It is the most important book. It's not coincidental that it's in the middle. That it is the central book because it gives us our modus operandi for a religious observance. We have radically different modus operandi, radically different modus operandi in our time. We have prayer and we have community in a very different way. But imagine if suddenly Judaism would be, through some potion, would cause synagogues and prayer life to completely disappear. What would we do? Now, not all Jews are in synagogues, not all Jews pray. Excuse me. But they are a critical part of the mechanism of our spiritual lives. Excuse me, it's my daughter, and it's 1 o'clock and I gotta go, so I will see you next week. Hi, sweetie, I was just finishing.